Alrighty, guys. So, welcome back. We are in week 6 still, looking at NTI Day 30, moving on from Russia to Africa. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Make sure you pay attention, take some good notes, because there will be a comprehension check over these video notes once you're done. But let's go ahead and we will get started. So, top 10 facts of Africa. When we're looking at Africa, we're looking at vast plateaus. So the first thing we want to talk about is vast plateaus. And much of the continent lies at least 1,000 feet above sea level. So plateaus are a risen but flat surface. So about pretty much most of the continent lies at that above sea, like that high mark above sea level. It's the second largest continent, and it's sometimes even referred to as the plateau continent. Here is an overview world map of Africa. Moving on, the second thing and one of the most important features of Africa is the Nile River. It's the world's longest river, in fact. It flows more than 4,000 miles through Uganda, the Sudan, and into Egypt. In terms of the Nile River's history throughout world history and civilization, it's been irrigated for thousands of years to bring water to farmland and to people throughout the area surrounding it. Because if you think of Africa, we think of it, a lot of it is desert. However, through that irrigation, the Nile River has been able to provide water and sustain life for a long time in these areas. 95%, in fact, of Egyptians depend on water from the Nile River. That's a really interesting fact. Here is an aerial shot of it. As you can see, the green within Africa is based solely around where the water comes from in terms of what the water the Nile River gives the continent. Here's some commerce on the river. You see a boat carrying more than likely what I would assume is wheat, because wheat has been a huge product that has come out of the Nile River Valley throughout world history and civilization. Wealth of resources. Africa is full of natural resources, plenty and scarcity at the same time, though. Huge amounts of the world's minerals. In fact, Africa has 42% of the world's cobalt, which is used to make high-grade steel for aircrafts and industrial engines. South Africa is the world's leading producer of chromium, which is used to make stainless steel. 80% of the world's platinum and 30% of the world's gold. So there's plenty of resources, but they're also very scarce as well. So when we talk about that scarcity, we get into the question of why has the mineral wealth in Africa not equaled economic prosperity for African countries? Well, it's because there's been a history and pretty dark history of European colonial rulers that developed the natural resources and the digging and the mines and stuff, and exports the wealth that comes with that to Europe. So European colonizers came to Africa and took a lot of the resources, and to this day still take advantage of a lot of the resources from Africa, and the wealth goes to Europe rather than going to these African countries. As a result, African nations lack the industrial base and money to develop them. So it's almost like they depend on, like I said, on those Europeaners still to this day to get the resources, but then they don't see any much benefit from it. Here you can see diamond miners in Sierra Leone, platinum miners. Moving on. When we talk about Africa, a key aspect of Africa is it is a warm continent. Most of Africa is in the tropics, in that tropical climate that we've talked about before. Africa's climate and vegetation types mirror each other north and south of the equator. So they're the same. Rainforests run along the equator in Africa. As we've talked about with the equator, that's the kind of climate and the kind of regions you get is that rainforest is also in Africa. North and south of the rainforest are tropical grasslands, which are referred to as savannas, what you typically think about with like savanna expeditions, where you have, the lions, giraffes, elephants, and things of that nature. Further north and south are deserts. So the farther you get away from the equator, north or south, you get desert areas within the continent, and huge deserts like the Sahara Desert. So if you look at these climate zones, it kind of breaks them down even more from what we just talked about. So your A's are more of your tropical areas within Africa. So right here along the equator and pretty much in the middle of the continent, you have your A's, which are more tropical. Your B's are subtropical. So your B's, and then C's are temperate. Subclassification of your tropics. So if it has a 1, it's cold tropical. If it has a 2, it's more of a warm tropical. So closer to the equator is obviously, warmer. And then water housing. So if it has an A, that stands for arid, which means it only has 0 to 2 months of like rainy months. SA would mean that it's semi-arid. So 3 to 5 rainy months. SH, semi-humid. So you have 6 to 9 rainy months. Obviously, that's going to be closer to the equator. And then humid, 10 to 12 rainy months. Again, right along the equator, and where you have much of your green land vegetation within Africa. So you see how climate really impacts Africa and where it is in relation to the equator on the continent, and how they kind of mirror each other as you go north and south. Here's an elephant in that savanna type area that we talked about. Like I mentioned earlier, you have the Sahara Desert, and this is going to be one of the top 10 things about Africa is the vastness of the Sahara Desert. It's the world's largest desert. It stretches 3,000 miles completely across the continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. So you have your Atlantic Ocean over here and your Red Sea over here. So it completely stretches across the whole entire continent. And it runs 1,200 miles north to south. Your temperatures in the Sahara Desert in the summer, it can get up to 136 degrees. Very, very hot. But then in the winter at night, it can get below freezing in desert areas as well. So you have very extreme climates in desert areas. And again, the Sahara being the largest one, not only in Africa, but in the world. Some images from the Sahara Desert, you can see just how dry it is in the Sahara Desert. And then the main source of travel along the Sahara Desert, because there are people that do travel across it, they stay in it sometimes, especially when you had earlier in history a nomad people that would move across the continent. You had people that would travel across these deserts, trade, things like that, and it still goes on today. And one of the main source of travel across the Sahara Desert is the camel, because it is an animal that can go long distances without needing to, have water supplies to drink and rehydrate, because they store water within themselves. Only about 20% of the Sahara Desert, though, surprisingly, is sand. It does have mountains, rock formations, and mostly made up of gravelly plains that make up the rest of it. And then, like I just said, camels are important for desert transportation because they can go, as this fact says right here, 17 days without water. So you think that gives you a little over 2 weeks before you would have to get your camel more water. Here's an image of a camel caravan going through the Sahara Desert. You can see some footprints they've left behind, or other caravans have left behind. There they are out in the middle of the dunes. Here's some of those rock formations that I was talking about. Again, so it's not really made up all of sand. You see formations kind of like these out in the U.S., the United States western areas. Number 6, a big thing when we talk about Africa and the geography of it, including the human geography of it, you have to think about the slave trade that happened in colonial times. So Europeans wanted slaves for their plantations in the Americas. Many African rulers took part in the slave trade. So at this time in Africa, you didn't really have countries set up yet. You had tribes that were fighting for control, power, and things like that. And what a lot of them did, and most of them did, was when they would defeat another tribe, those prisoners they would then sell into the slave trade to go to the colonies to become slaves on these plantations. They had already been selling slaves to other African rulers and even the Arabs in the Middle East. By the end of the slave trade in 1870, so you think this lasted a really long time, millions of slaves have been transported to the Americas and Europe. So the slave trade drastically impacted the continent of Africa, and it shaped a lot of what has happened to them even now. 7, the scramble for Africa. So, like I said, Africa didn't really have like established like countries and a government and things like that during these colonial times. So in the 19th century, you had many European nations that were interested in those raw materials and those natural resources that we talked about that Africa has a lot of. And so they wanted to colonize them and control parts of Africa to obtain those resources. So you had many European nations fighting for control. They didn't want to fight over Africa, but they wanted that control. But they didn't want to go to war and things like that and have like actual altercations over it. So to prevent war, the 14 nations met at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885. To develop rules for dividing Africa. When you think about that, that's really shocking that something like that would happen, that a meeting would happen where these foreign countries, European countries, are deciding, here's how we're going to split up Africa. And I'll tell you right now, there weren't really any Africans that had a say in what was going to happen. It was just the Europeans. But that's the way things went back then. That's the way they did that with the Americas. That was just colonization. But you can see in this image you have France, Belgium, the Netherlands or Holland, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain all tugging on this cutout of the continent of Africa. So like I just said, no African rulers were invited to the conference. The conference decided that any country could claim land in Africa by telling other nations of their claims and by showing them that they could control the area. So that's all you had to do to be able to claim a certain part of Africa, was tell the other nations, hey, I've claimed this, and then showing that you could control the area, which usually meant imprisoning and enslaving the native peoples of that area. They divided Africa without regard to where Africa ethnic or linguistic groups lived. So say, Portugal was taking one part of Africa and then France was taking the other part of it. If they divided a tribe or a linguistic or ethnic group that shared common cultures and things like that, they didn't care. You were divided upon those European colonial lines. So they didn't take any, they weren't like, this tribe lives here, so we'll cut out that little part of it. No, they just cut it wherever they claimed the land. The set boundaries that combined peoples were who were traditional enemies and divided others who were not. So not only are you dividing peoples that maybe got together and mingled and were friends and lived cohabitantly, you possibly put together tribes that didn't get along and had been at war with each other in the past and were enemies for hundreds of thousands of years. That's what that did, because it didn't take any care for who they were dividing. It just mattered if they fell in your colonial lines. By 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free of European control. The division of Africa is often cited as one of the cause of political violence and ethnic conflicts in Africa in the 20th century. So what we've seen in more modern history, and some of it's still unfortunately going on today, is mass genocide, which is the mass killing of a lot of people, civil wars, violence, just terrible, terrible conflict, and political violence within a lot of African countries. And like I said, it's still going on because of dating back to all of this, because these lines were drawn without any kind of regard for who those lines were being drawn between and who they were putting together and things like that. So that's why it can be traced back to all this, that there's so many issues going on in Africa in more modern history. So here's an image of the Berlin Conference. Here's a map of the European claims in Africa as of 1914. So Spain had this little bit up in here, the orange. France had all this blue, including down in here in Madagascar. Great Britain had the pink. Belgium had the yellow right in here. Italy is the dark green. Germany is the brown that you see. And then Portugal is the light green. And then independent, you have Ethiopia over here and Liberia over here. Or Ethiopia and Liberia. I think I'm getting the two mixed up. The economic legacy of colonialism, obviously a loss of resources for Africa, because these colonizers came in and just took as much as they could for their own economic benefit without any regard for the people who actually live there on the land. Disruption of political systems, like I said, when those colonizers came in, they kind of took control, and the tribal leaders and things like that didn't have the control anymore. Cultural and ethnic oppression of its people. So obviously when you have colonizers that come in, they oppress the people that have lived there, both culturally and ethnically. Obviously, if you have Christian European nations coming into African tribes that maybe had religion and had culture, but those Christian Europeans saw it as not the right culture and not the right religion, they're obviously going to change that and say, hey, this is what you should be practicing, and this is what you should be doing to get to heaven. Very similar to what you see with the European colonizers and Native Americans is what you see in Africa. The only economic infrastructure developed was to aid the removal of raw materials. So they didn't come into these African territories and build them up because out of like the generosity of their hearts. They built up whatever they needed to remove the raw materials. So the only infrastructure that was developed was what would aid them in getting those natural resources and that wealth to Europe. They left little money to develop roads, railroads, airports, or any kind of education system. So like I said, it wasn't like they came into Africa and were like, hey, let's build this up to help Africa. No, it was, let's build what we need to, get the money and get the power and things like that, and not do anything else. Moving on to 8, policy of apartheid in South Africa. So apartheid in the early 1900s, 1948, there was a white minority government instituted the policy of apartheid, which was the complete separation of races. So if you think in South Africa, you have a majority of African population, but this white minority government was what took control and maintained control in the early 1900s. And they instituted, like I said, that policy of apartheid, which is complete separation of the races. You can see the sign up here: for use by white persons, these public premises and the amenities thereof have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons. So apartheid, to try to connect it, is somewhat similar to Jim Crow in the South in the early 1900s, in late 1800s, early 1900s in America. It was this idea of the separation of the races. It banned social contact between blacks and whites, established segregated schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods. So again, very, very similar in comparison to Jim Crow era in the South in America. In 1949, Nelson Mandela, who's pictured over here, emerged as one of the leaders of the African National Congress. So the leaders of the African branch of the National Congress within South Africa. He led a long struggle to end the apartheid that resulted in Mandela being imprisoned. He was imprisoned for his role in trying to get rid of apartheid within South Africa. This is a 1982 photo. As you can see, boundary between white and all races area. So a photo showing the apartheid. In the 1980s, nations around the world, including the U.S., pressured South Africa to end the apartheid policy. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became the president, and he wanted to change South Africa. He wanted peaceful resolution. He ended the apartheid policy, and he even released Nelson Mandela from prison. In 1994, when there was the first election that involved all the races, Mandela actually won election and became president. But if you think about it, he was imprisoned in 1940s, 50s. He sat in prison for almost 40 years around that to eventually then become the president of South Africa. And Mandela is one of the most quoted people in history, and was just a very, very influential person in South African history and African history. And again, like I said, one of the most quoted people in history from some of his quotes when he was in prison and when he got out and was president and things like that. Moving on to 9, Africa's economy today. So most African countries are worse off economically than they were in the 1960s, just after they gained independence from European nations. So again, a lot of them, like I said, are worse off than they were when they gained their freedom. Again, it can be traced back to that fact that nothing was left for them to, no foundations were left for them to kind of build on from the Europeans, because the Europeans only built stuff to help them economically prosper with those natural resources they were taking from Africa. In fact, most Africans don't have access to computers or other aspects of high technology. On the road to development, trying to reduce debt, increase cooperation between like tribes and stuff in the different nations. So trying to end all the conflict that's been happening in modern history within Africa. Building industries, diversifying and shift from exporting raw materials. So bringing in even more industries into Africa rather than just the raw material aspect. Educating their workers, reversing the brain drain. So we talk about brain drain in like rural counties in America, how the best and the brightest from rural counties a lot of times go off to college and they never come back, like doctors and things like that come from rural counties in the United States usually don't go back and become doctors at their in their like rural area. They usually go off and work somewhere else. Well, that happens in Africa too. A lot of people that do become educated or do leave the country for education, they don't come back. So that brain drain is that departure of African professionals to Western countries that are more developed and things like that. 10, healthcare. AIDS has become a pandemic in Africa. So Africa does struggle a lot with healthcare because of things like AIDS, which is a pandemic right now, has been for a long time within Africa. It has had a devastating effect on the continent. In fact, in 2000, nearly 26 million people in Africa were living with HIV or AIDS. Also in 2000, 3 million people died of AIDS worldwide. 2.4 million of those lived in Africa. It's an astonishing amount. So that's the end of our slide about Africa. Again, make sure you take your comprehension check after this. As always, hope you guys are doing well. I hope you're healthy. And also, if you need anything, please let us know. But hopefully, I will talk to you all soon.